Welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast brought to you by AMPLOS. Dr. Drew Brannon, joined today by Dr. Cory Shaffer. Dr. Shaffer, good day.
What's happening?
Very good to have you together, to have us together for this one. Now I want to be clear about from the outset of our topic today. Although this has never been a challenge for me, I've never really experienced conflict with people in the workplace. I know that you have. So we are talking today about the fact that there has been and will be conflicts between people in the workplace. And like I said, although not a struggle of mine, I'm glad you're here because I think you can speak to this.
I'm really glad to be apparently the resident expert on it.
So I'm obviously joking because anybody who has spent any length of time whatsoever in any workplace has encountered varying measures of conflict. And so I think right off the jump, Cory, probably what we need to kind of talk a little bit about is even when you start to say that word and that word comes out of your mouth and you go down that path of like conflict in the workplace, where does your mind start to go?
I mean, I think first of all, anytime you're talking about interactions between people, and especially an office environment or a team environment of any capacity, you're talking about relationships is at the core of this.
Yes.
Specifically within conflict, or when I think conflict and conflict in the workplace, I mean, it just the dynamic nature of if you're working in a team at all, and like I mentioned, in an office environment, whatever, just interactions with people, inherently there's going to be some conflict. Now, I think most people hear conflict and immediately their mind goes to negative.
Yes.
I don't necessarily think that it has to be that way. I understand why it gets, the sort of a bad rep like it does. But I do think that conflict in relationships and, even in the office, in the work environment can be a good thing.
Yeah.
If done well,
right.
If done, quote, appropriately, if that's a better word, I'm not sure, they can be a really good thing. And I think foster growth, like more trust, a better relationship moving forward if the conflict is navigated well.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in more detail today, but I completely agree with that. And probably everybody who is listening to this, we've all been in that spot where you have this feeling that maybe you can't even articulate that well that exists in a relationship because there's some measure of tension and you know it and they know it. And eventually, somehow, some way, we end up talking about this. And that might be a tough, challenging, tension-filled conversation. But in most instances, once you have that conversation and you're now on the other side of it, how do you typically feel? Better.
Always
exactly.
Better. Right.
Better. And so, this idea of, I agree with you completely. When we hear that word, it's very similar. We talk about habits all the time. When people hear the word habits, the most common thing they think of first immediately is like the things they aren't doing that they should be. When people hear this thing of conflict, it really does have this negative leaning, negative bend to it. And although we understand why, a big part of our conversation today is to help everybody see and understand there can be a great deal of purpose in conflict. And as you said, Cory, when handled well, this can be very life-giving to relationships.
Yeah. Writer, author Patrick Lencioni has a take on this that I think is pretty good. Just, again, him coming from a background in working in organizations and workplaces. He calls it his conflict continuum, which I think is a really simple way of thinking about this. But if you imagine on one end, there's the complete there's no conflict at all right? And on the opposite end of that continuum are these sort of mean-spirited, harsh, almost just like personal attacks, like aggressive, destructive type of conflict. And the midpoint between the two, he calls just his ideal conflict point. Like that's where we would love to be.
Right.
Any team, any organization, I think any relationship for that matter, like there's a point where conflict is necessary. And again, like we talked about, can be a very good thing. Most organizations, most companies, most teams, unfortunately, I think tend to lean in that direction of what he describes as artificial harmony.
Yep.
Lack of conflict, surface level, everything seems good. Everybody's kind of getting along. But because things are not being addressed that probably need to be addressed, there's always inherently a level of tension, resentment within the group, because there's just lack of transparency. Like, we're not addressing the things that we need to address. Like you said, there's not that sense of, hey, we worked through something together and we feel better about it. There's just always a sense of there's something that's off. There's something that needs to be talked about, but we're not addressing it.
Yep. And as we're talking, and I like this model a lot, and although today's conversation is about work environment, kind of professional context, I just want to kind of tune our listeners into this. There's a lot of personal relationship application as well, because you could say the same when I look at this and think about this model for personal relationships as well.
Sure.
There are many personal relationships out there that have a great deal of artificial harmony occurring of, hey, we're kind of acting like everything's cool and we aren't bringing things up, although they're on our hearts or in our minds, and we're just going to let them kind of live beneath the surface. Not a real healthy way to exist. And so if we work from left to right, artificial harmony, we've got ideal conflict point in the middle, and then the personal attacks, which, Cory, I think we're defining that as the equivalent of a work environment in which there's we certainly don't have psychological safety.
Sure.
It is, as you said, at times kind of harsh criticisms, very tension-filled. We are openly antagonistic toward people. Like, it's tough.
Yeah, there's potentially, belittling comments being made and that type of thing. Like, again, very personal, mean-spirited in nature, for regardless of the reason. So, what he describes too is it's important that people understand that, again, conflict is a good thing. It's healthy for an organization, for any relationship. But what's really helpful to think about, usually to learn where that ideal conflict point is, you usually have to step over it. You're usually probably going to step in the direction where things are maybe a little bit too destructive or personal. It's usually immediately recognized.
Yeah.
And then the recovery of that back to that ideal conflict point usually gives everybody involved a better understanding of just where that exists, like where the line is.
Yep. And I think, just to maybe make one more point on this model as we're kind of entering into and framing up this conversation, what we're saying very clearly is that we need varying forms of conflict in the workplace for us to function at our best. And we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that, oh, well, a healthy culture and a great team culture means we don't have conflict. That's not what we're saying.
No, and again, conflict can be as simple as, hey, I throw out an idea in the middle of a team meeting and you say, hey, I disagree.
Yeah.
And this is why. And we just talk through it. You can see how that's productive.
Right. Totally.
That should be a part of, brainstorming, decision making. That is indicative of a psychologically safe environment where I can present an idea. We can talk about something openly and transparently. I'm not clinging to the idea and taking it personal that you don't like it.
Yep.
We're just sorting through and trying to find the best possible answer. That's still conflict.
Yep.
To be clear, I think sometimes, again, that's why conflict gets a bad rap, is it's always just like, construed in such a negative way, but just the inherent conflict of disagreement, right? Like, that's conflict. And that's fine. That's a good thing in a lot of ways, because that's how we get to the best idea, for our group, for our organization.
And even just in that example, you look at the research on decision-making and ideas, and most of what I'm most familiar with in the literature is you tend to see that kind of 5 plus or minus 2 people in the room. Well, if you have that number of people in the room and we have a loud voice plus nothing but head nodding, that's artificial harmony.
Absolutely.
That's where you might as well just not have anyone else in the room besides the person talking, because they're just wasting people's time. We've got to be willing and able to say, hey, hold on, like, pump the brakes on that. Maybe you should think about this. Or actually, I see it differently. I would do it this way. And us all being mature enough adults to engage in a healthy dialogue around that. That's what we talk about, kind of an ideal conflict point.
So after all of that talk about Lencioni's model here and conflict and how it can be good, we're going to talk about bad conflict. So how about that?
Well, again, that's why you're here.
Yeah. All right. So walk us through this study. Harvard Business Review did a study that I think is pretty fascinating. Drew, walk the listeners through it and some of the findings. I do think it's pretty interesting. It's pretty fascinating.
I agree. So their Harvard Business Review, which we'll refer to as HBR going forward, but a fantastic publication. If you're not yet reading it, I would encourage you to. There was a study that HBR conducted They included about 1,000 managers across different industries, and a combination of managers and direct reports, 1,000 people total, across 76 companies from all over the world, which is a great sample, right? It's diverse in terms of geography, industry, role, that type of thing. And what they found, which was, I agree, Cory, completely fascinating, is there are 4 specific triggers that account for or cause approximately 91% of conflict within organizations. So in other words, if we're piecing together a list of like what causes conflict, what are the triggers in which that really kind of drive conflict, there are 4 common reasons, 4 common factors that account for about 91%, which is a really big number.
Yeah, that's huge. I think if you just think about, again, across organizations, but just people and all the different personalities and roles and backgrounds and educations and whatever you can think of, all these different variables all mixed up into a pot of people and relationships, and you can boil it all down to 4 things.
Four things, 4
pretty
categories.
interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And yet, what's so interesting about that too to me is I agree with how you started the conversation today. Human beings are extremely complex things. Like we're so complex, we're complicated, which is why conflict is so common. And yet as complicated as we are, as complex as humans are, there's really kind of 4 main things that drive these problems. So let's go through them, beginning with the first one. So the kind of the leading variable here, the most common driver of conflict between people in the workplace is communication differences. Communication differences. In fact, it accounts for approximately 40% of conflict. So Cory, let's drill down on that. When we say communication differences, what are we really talking about?
Yeah, I think this is where the work that more so you than me, but I'm versed in it, familiar with it. Just the role of how people are wired, personality, and how that influences communication preferences. You and I, for example, probably a good example of that. You being, I think, appreciating and how you communicate is more direct and to the point, a little bit more succinct.
I've been told that.
and myself, just different. Probably a little bit more reserved in how I communicate, really take time to process, to think, very careful with words and so on. And I think probably even between you and I, that's probably caused moments of conflict.
Sure.
Over almost, over 9 years now of working together.
Yeah.
Just those differences in how we're wired. It's not you're doing something wrong or I'm doing something wrong, but just the differences between us and how we prefer to communicate and how we prefer to be communicated with inherently is going to bring about some conflict.
Yeah, let's focus, because the one word in there of differences is such an important word. And here's something that I see happen so often in teams and organizations is we use the word difference or differences, but internally what we really think is good versus bad or right versus wrong. And specifically, let's go back to personality, because that's a place where difference shows up a bunch. I agree with that, Cory, is we talk about how I'm wired one way and he or she is wired another way, and we are different. But what's living beneath the surface is my belief that mine is better than hers.
Correct.
And that in and of itself creates major problems in so many ways, but communication is just one of them, of like we kind of live with this embedded notion that we do it the right way and others don't. And, one specific granular example of how I see that play out is it's incredible to me how often you hear a person say, well, I know I was totally clear with what I said and what I wanted to see happen. And the person receiving that communication has no idea what they're supposed to do.
Right. And that's probably blending some of the others that we'll get here on the list. But yes, that is the point, is just how we tend to believe that because I understand it the way that I said it, you do as well.
Yep.
And
you should.
There's sometimes just such a massive chasm between us in the understanding, just because, again, we're wired different. We think about it different, and we're going to communicate it different. So to use the verbiage that you use, or to use the metaphor, or, even just to be as direct, succinct, or long-winded. It's like, man, you're crossing a lot of space there and assuming that the other person would say it just like that.
Yep. Now let's make one additional point here that I think this is important. I've seen this pop up a bunch is this idea of communication differences. I have seen people use that to justify inappropriate behavior. And I'll give you an example of, and you're right. You pegged. I mean, I've taken all the tests, and you don't even need to take a test to kind of know certain things about yourself. But I am a very direct communicator, and that's not always a good thing. But I have seen extreme versions of that where people will be okay, really kind of like running people over communication wise in a work setting, and then just kind of notching it under this category of, well, hey, that's just kind of, I'm a direct communicator, or like I'm a D on the disc, or and it's like, well, hold on a second, man. Like that doesn't mean you can run people over.
Yeah, exactly. And again, there's a difference too between understanding how I naturally communicate, and that may be a strength, but it's not a strength if it's not how the other person communicates.
Yeah.
And it's my responsibility as the one giving the message to try to communicate in such a way that they will understand. Yep. Not necessarily in a way that just suits me.
Right.
But yeah, all of this just highlights exactly the point is just the issues in communication. I mean, we've both done enough work in the corporate world. I'm sure you've seen this. I've seen this for plenty, sure. Right? It pops up quite a bit. So to think about how 4 out of every 10 points of conflict in an organization are going to come back to this is like, yep, that makes sense. That checks out.
Totally. And then, before we leave this one, I think we got to do the other side of the coin too, though, Cory, which is we're talking a lot about kind of the direct tellers. What about the conflict avoidant people? What about the people who are very passive, who aren't willing, maybe they're scared to death to like say what they really think or advocate for how they really feel. And so they stay really, really, really passive, and it just builds up.
Yeah. Yep. And so because they're avoiding the conflict, and it doesn't matter what the reason for that is, but because they're avoiding it and they're not willing to voice what they think or what they have to say or whatever, I mentioned earlier, I think like the resentment just kind of builds and builds and builds, as if the other person is just supposed to know, right, how they feel, or they're the ones who are supposed to, start the conversation and open the door to it and so on. And ultimately all you're doing is you're just pushing the conflict further down the road.
Yep.
But it's just building and escalating, every day that goes by that things are not talked about.
Yep. And both of those sides of the coin we've just discussed are problems. And one is not like capital P problem. The other one is lowercase p problem. Like they're both problems, and one is not better than the other. And you aren't better than the other, whichever one you aren't. Mm-hmm. Okay, so leading variable, 40% of the variance stems from communication differences. What's our next one?
In terms of how much of the variance is accounted for, the second one on the list is just over 20% at 22%, unclear expectations. Go ahead. If you're just going to, you got to explain why you had that reaction.
Unclear expectations. And yeah, I was already kind of going there a little bit with that comment I made a minute ago.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I mentioned that.
So you hear this a bunch in lots of different people dynamics, but it's translated different ways. But the real root of the problem here is someone feeling very confident that they have laid it out so well, so concretely, in a very objective way that like this couldn't be misunderstood, and yet the person who's receiving it doesn't understand at all. And it could be because they said too much, it could be because they said too little, it could be because they aren't entirely sure, and yet they're trying to kind of set some type of expectation. But regardless of how we got there, the bottom line is the person who's being held accountable doesn't have a clear picture of what they're supposed to be doing. Or maybe they have a little bit of an idea of kind of the responsibilities, but what they don't know is like, what does great look like in this role? Like, how do I know if I'm doing well?
Yeah, and one of the other ones on the list, I'm going to jump ahead here for a second, just so we can differentiate. Opaque performance standards and unclear expectations, I think on the surface look very similar, but I think they're different.
They are.
Right. So
They
to
are.
me, unclear expectations is behavioral stuff.
Uh-huh.
Performance standards would be, at least how I interpret things. And you just noted, like, what does great look like in this?
Yeah.
That's probably a performance standard.
I agree. Yeah, I think unclear expectations are more about what am I supposed to be doing?
There you go. Yeah.
Functionally speaking, behaviorally speaking. Opaque performance standards is what does great look like?
Exactly.
How will I know how well I'm doing?
Yeah. And I know we're kind of blending two things together here, so to separate them back out for a second. Unclear expectations. And this is why this is really hard. It's so challenging. Because even when we were talking about communication differences, for a second, my mind wanted to go to like, oh yeah, even how some people prefer, and some of this is obviously, generational, talk in person, talk on the phone, talk via text or email. Like those are unclear expectations on how we communicate.
Right. They are.
But again, that something as simple as that, I don't think many organizations or leaders are ever really taking the time to define, here's what that looks like for us, and to be very clear and upfront. So this is actually where I'm going to give a shout to, I know, an avid listener of the podcast, individual who has been on the podcast, a guest of the show, friend of the program, if you will.
Okay, who is that?
Mike Noonan.
Mike Noonan,
Clemson Soccer. So Coach Noonan, shout out to you. It's been a while since I've sat in one of these introductory like preseason meetings that Coach Noonan runs. But what he would do every year with the team in his day one kind of preseason stuff would be to go through, here's how we communicate within this program.
Oh, that's cool.
And the hierarchy of like, number one, you will always communicate in person.
Huh.
Down to then, number two, phone call, hear your voice, right? Now we get down into text message, email, that kind of thing.
I like that a lot.
But the point is, like, he's very clearly outlining in this one thing where it just said, like, let's say most teams would just say like, hey, be proactive in your communication.
Yeah, vague.
So very vague, exactly. So they get a lot of text messages and stuff like that. And a coach might be frustrated by that. Well, like, you were in the building, why don't you come talk to me? Well, coach, that's on you. You didn't set the expectation with specificity around what you want. If you want people to come talk to you in person, then say, this is sort of first and foremost the mode of communication. So I know I kind of went back there to communication, but that's just one example of something that seems clear on the surface, just like, oh yeah, communicate.
Right.
But so vague, nothing clear about it. If you can drill down though and say, hey, here's exactly what that standard looks like for us, you're making a very clear expectation.
It's the difference between a leader saying to his or her team, hey, let's try to be mindful of how we are sending communications after work hours versus no emails after 5 p.m.
Correct.
And I'm not saying one is good and bad or any of this stuff, but those are two different worlds.
You've established at that point a line in the stand.
Yes.
On exactly what the expectation or what the standard is for behavior in this case.
And just quick circle back real quickly to the Coach Noonan example, which I love. And I just want to make this point. Some of our listeners probably don't realize this, that they're defending national champions in men's soccer, and which is awesome. We talk about this all the time of like, so many things matter, right? Like do you need to have talented people to be great at anything? Yes, you do. All of that matters. Do you need to have a great culture? Of course, but like so many things matter. And so like, I'm not even going to call that a small thing. I'm going to call that a detail. But to have that degree of detail in your communication, it all matters.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a great example of, we do this exercise a lot with organizations, with teams in establishing, or even just, for yourself personally, like establishing a set of values for yourself.
Right.
But within that process, multiple steps involved of not just, hey, what kind of person are you aspiring to being? What are the things that are really important to you? But taking time to define it, one, and then the third step, probably the most powerful, is to define and present some concrete examples of what that looks like how it shows up. Yep. That's ultimately what we're talking about here. Is we're talking about taking something that is relatively broad, general, abstract, but if you can nail down with specificity exactly what it looks like, you're getting clearer and clearer in expectations.
Yep.
So if you think about how much of that exists in, just the corporate world, we just talked about communication as one. Think about like attire. professional dress. Well, that means something different, to every single person in your organization.
Yep.
Right. So to see people show up in various forms of what you might deem to be professional, it's like, well, that's what you set yourself up for.
Yep.
There wasn't clarity.
Where are your Jordans today, by the way?
We got dunks on.
We're talking about professional dress.
We got dunks on today.
No Jordans. That would be perfect.
But you see my point, right? Is I think a lot of the time, and this I think is especially important now. Just two different examples, and these just came off the top of my head. But communication and let's say something like professional attire, how different the modes of communication are, or what professional attire means from somebody who's Gen Z compared to a boomer. Right. So if you got this big, massive organization that's spanning generations, it's like it means something different to everybody. If you aren't clear on what your expectations are for each of those things, it's probably going to continue to lead to frustration. In this case, for leadership or I don't know, HR.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's hit our fourth here because we've hit communication differences, unclear expectations. We kind of lumped in opaque performance standards there as well. The last one, and this is about 16% of the puzzle piece here, unreasonable time constraints. Unreasonable time constraints, which can be a bunch of things, of course, but I'll offer this one and then I'll kick it to you, Cory. Many people in a professional environment will put their head down and work really hard for a long period of time, even though they might feel like the demands on them are unfair and unreasonable. Mm-hmm. And the reasons they do that are often very easy to understand, beginning with they need to provide for their families. And it's not just as simple as like, I'm fed up with this, I'm going to go do something different somewhere else. Sometimes people will think that way, but people will go really hard and yet they're bothered by it. They feel like what's being asked of them is unfair.
Yeah.
Just one example.
Yeah. And again, probably such a variety of reasons for this. I know we mentioned earlier, so I'll come back to it. Some of it I do think is still about just how you're wired. I think everybody has the size of their gas tank is a little bit bigger, right? So if the person who's leading the project, for example, has this, or is just this endless resource of energy and has this massive gas tank for what they can just do in any given day or any given week, just the amount of energy that they have to expend, and the other person has half the size of that, there's conflict.
Oh yeah, big time.
Right? There's resentment on both sides, right? Because the person with all that energy is looking at the other individual and feeling like, why are you slowing this down? Or you're lazy. What are you doing? And the other individual is going like, man, how do you keep up this pace? Like, what in the world are we doing here? Like, are we trying to burn the candle at both ends, every day forever to accomplish this project? So you can just see how inherently, and I'm just pointing to something big and broad like personality, but everybody is wired a little bit differently for something like this. And I think it's not hard to imagine there's where some conflict arises. Yeah.
I'll offer a concrete example on that as well. I remember I was working with a guy several years ago who had his leader within this company, let's just say this, was very difficult to work for. And we were having a conversation about this one day, and I'll never forget this. He said to me, he's like, okay, I figured something out. He said, I don't know that I will ever again take a role working for a leader whose kid either A, doesn't have kids, or B, his kids have already left the house. I was like, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. And he said, it's not a thing for him at all to work a lot on nights and weekends. Mm-hmm. Because at times, I'm sure it's a matter like, what else is he going to do? At times. And he's like, I can't keep doing this. Yeah. Like his expectation on us is to do the same. And I've got like 3 little kids running around and stuff.
Right, right.
So it can happen and show up in ways such as that. Okay, so that, again, let's put a wrap on that study. Very, very interesting. Any final thoughts on that
just
study?
a final thought on the time constraints thing. I think sometimes that exists, and I've heard this from clients that I work with. It's like usually whoever's dictating workload, right? Let's say leadership or management or something like that. They're sometimes not even aware of what's on the other end of like how many things are already on that individual's plate. And I think that's where frustration can sometimes exist is just a misunderstanding of like, man, I've got 10 other projects going on, and like you just added this one that has, been marked urgent and is supposed to go to the top of the priority list. It's not that I don't want to help or that I can't help or what. It's just, where do you expect me to slot this in?
Yep.
And when everything is marked urgent, nothing is urgent.
100%.
So just one other example, I think, of where that exists, beyond just, again, personality and that type of thing, but it's just maybe a misunderstanding or a lack of awareness around, I don't know, let's say a leader and just the team, and how much can each individual handle? What do they currently have on their in terms of workload? Like, what do they have on their plate? Do they have the margin to be able to do this? Mm-hmm. So just another piece there.
Yep. Okay, let's close the loop on that study, which is a great study. Again, I think really, really interesting. And let's switch gears here and talk a little bit about what are some things that get in the way of our ability to resolve conflict. Because we talk a lot about like, okay, how it can live and where it can pop up, but we aren't exactly great at resolving it either. What gets in the way?
We mentioned this earlier. I think this one's probably very real, and it exists in any relationship, in any workplace in some capacity, but avoidance,
no doubt,
is obviously going to be a really big one. Like, if we're just not even, we, in this case, are aware, most likely, that there is some tension, there is a need to have some conflict, we just don't want to deal with it.
Right.
So we avoid it.
Yep.
That's obviously going to be one, and interfere with our ability to resolve it. If we're avoiding it, there's not going to be any resolution to it.
Yep, totally. Avoidance is a big deal. I'll also include in there pride/ego gets in the way. It's pretty much a sure thing that because both people are involved, each person shares some of the responsibility. Mm-hmm. But if you are looking at a dynamic where there's existing conflict with a mentality that none of this is on you, or maybe a tiny puzzle piece is the only part that's on you, and you're not owning enough of this, that's ego.
Yep.
And I don't know about you, Cory, but I don't exactly feel real motivated to work through conflict in a healthy way if someone's not owning his or her share.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was related to another point here, but just lack of candor in communication, right? So now we're actually talking about it, but if it's all just stays on the surface, we're not actually doing anything productive.
I'm sorry you felt that way.
Yeah, we're kind of checking the box on conflict resolution, but all the feelings still exist when we walk away from the conversation. So the lack of candor or transparency, honesty within the communication, that's really the only thing that's going to help you work through the conflict and come out, like we said from the start, better as a result of it.
So I threw in my example there of like, I'm sorry you felt that way. I'm sorry you got upset. I'm sorry that bothered you. Or
even just,
there's no candidness. That's a veiled.
Sure. Or even just like, hey, I know that you're feeling some type of way. Like, let's talk about it. Tell me how you feel. And the response is just kind of like, no, I'm good.
Yeah, that too.
Right. Like, clearly there's something wrong here. If you can't be honest, or if you're not willing to be transparent about how you feel, we are not going to be able to work through this.
Yep.
Right. So, or a lot of the times I think this is sort of a combination of like lack of candor and avoidance. Hey, we know that something needs to be addressed here. Like, this is where I think they'll tell you what you want to hear just to get through the conversation.
Yep. And then let me just make one additional point on one you mentioned a second ago, and then we'll move forward. The busyness one. Everybody's busy. We laugh about this. I mean, how often you see someone and, hey, how are things? So busy, man. We're just ripping and roaring, and that's fantastic. We're always happy for people who are busy, but everyone's busy. And you look at your day and the many things you've got to tackle and what you're focused on. And this is not to discredit the importance of any of those things. However, if there is existing conflict that is alive within your team, within your kind of sub-team, whatever it is, that's got to be a priority. And so not dealing with that because you're, quote, too busy, and instead focusing on X, Y, and Z, really regardless of what they are, is just a mistake. Like, you've got to recognize the interference that is being created as a result of the existing conflict. Doesn't mean you're a bad leader, doesn't mean this person's a bad team member, but you got to make time for this.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just keep trucking. It's got to be. It's got to be. Okay. So let's, as we kind of, hit a couple last things here, Cory, what can we do?
Yeah, just 4 quick bullet points we'll run through. Some of these are going to seem very obvious or like they're low-hanging fruit, and to be honest, they should be. But number 1, establish clear channels of communication, and then when you communicate, do so with candor. I mentioned from the start, and this is why I give props to Coach Noonan, but how many organizations or teams have you ever heard of that take the time to say, this is the hierarchy and how we expect you to communicate?
Yeah,
right. Like that's really, really good.
It is. It's
and
great.
So there's a ton of clarity on exactly what the expectation is around that. But now, once we've opened the door and now we are communicating in whatever capacity it is, let's be candid. Candid is then honest and truthful. Would encourage our listeners, point you in the direction of Radical Candor by Kim Scott. Highly recommend. Really good book. I'm sure you can find some YouTube videos on her or from her if you're into that sort of thing. But establishing clear channels of communication, 1, and then communicating with candor, I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, and then being transparent about expectations is big. That's aligns very closely with the Coach Noonan example of, you think about the skills. Let's focus on leaders for a minute. What are the skills of great leaders? They normally have a number of skills. That's why they're great at what they do. But that's not just a given. Mm-hmm. A leader should never assume that he or she is good at creating clear expectations, or that they even create clear expectations. That's not a given. Like, that's a skill.
Yeah, and I think within that, again, the Noonan example is still good here, like providing concrete examples.
Yeah, right.
And when you see that thing show up and done in a really good way, to point to it and to celebrate it and say, hey, that's exactly what we talked about, or there's a concrete example of, the expectation that we discussed. Every time you do that, it helps people kind of triangulate with a little bit, more, I guess, clarity, or we get closer and closer to honing in on a shared understanding of exactly what you mean by, whatever expectation it is that you set. So
let's hit these last 2.
Yeah. Discuss and manage time expectations. So again, I think that's probably done in some capacity from time to time, but this should probably be more regular conversations just to ensure that, hey, every time there's an additional added responsibility, like, hey, let's talk about what the expectations are on, let's say, when that's going to get done, or how you're going to be chipping away at it, or how does this fit in with everything else you have on your plate? Like, any of that kind of stuff, I think, is important. But again, it's all just about establishing clarity around time.
Yep. So time, and then role as well. Task and role expectations of, like, be sure everybody understands what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
What they're responsible for. Again, don't assume that. I can't always say that AMPLOS has been a model example of this. I mean, I think a lot of small businesses where people are wearing multiple hats, we've asked people to wear a lot of hats.
Yeah.
And that hadn't always come with clarity of role expectation. So, yeah, there's some quick hitters for you there. So I know we need to kind of wrap up here. Kind of closing thoughts from me would be, if you are sitting around and kind of assessing your team, your culture, your organization, and if your prevailing thought is, wow, we really don't ever have conflict around here, don't lean back a little bit further in your chair and feel great, because that isn't necessarily a great sign. The odds are either you're in that artificial harmony stage, or there are other possible explanations for why the waters seem to be so calm. But as we've talked about here today, we need a little bit of friction. We need some purposeful conflict to really drive high-performing teams and cultures.
Yeah, agreed. I don't have much to add to that. I think well said. Back to Lencioni's, model, his continuum, I think it's all about just striving to find that ideal conflict point for the relationships that you have, or for the culture that you've built within your office. Like you mentioned, if you're leaning in a direction of artificial harmony, or you feel like, oh no, we don't have conflict very often, it's either you're unaware of the conflict that exists and just haven't addressed it, or I'm not sure what else, but that's probably the case.
Either way, we got to do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. So
Awesome.
that's it. I think again the study is real, though. I think you and I have the opportunity, just given what we do, to talk to a lot of different teams, organizations, and so we probably hear this kind of stuff maybe more than our listeners do. But every one of our listeners, you're within a team, you're within an organization, and my guess is, as we go through that list of the things that trigger conflict, at least one of them check the box for you. So,
or more, perhaps.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you for tuning in as always. Just as a reminder, if you find our podcast to be helpful and resourceful in your life, always appreciate a review either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Let us know how we're doing and how we can continue to serve you better and better. Thanks so much.